Legacy of a Traitor. Chapter 7. The Aerorites now feared us, no longer smiling when we walked the streets. They also murmured amongst themselves of the brutal display of the king, and they no longer joined in monthly festivities. Those close to the dead began to whisper of revenge. When this reached King Genra, he ordered the king shields to impose his will once more. I balked at the command, just for a moment, but my oath and covenant bade me to obey. So began the spiral of damnation. Verse 7 of the Confessional Monolith. The days continued to press on, the ever-moving flow of time beating at Seth's mind like the drums of longboats filled with pirates and their wrath approaching Mist Bay. He'd never heard them himself, but the stories in the archives had been quite impactful in his youth. Even now, as he glanced at the mid-afternoon sun beaming through the decorated windows in spears of many colors, he couldn't help but compare this situation to those of his forefathers, pitiful as his problem was. If the proper defenses and preparations were not ready by the time the sharp weapons and water-paddling appendages reached his people, then blood would be on Seth's hands. And so it is only in the categories of fish and children's prizes that we are slightly below necessary quantities, at least as far as the current menu of the celebrational feast is concerned. Madame Athel finished her report as Seth gnawed at a small roll. She handed the abacus back to Marchie, then sat down at the Great Hall's table. Oh, yes, we don't have to worry about the prizes. Several were commissioned to Thesling, the Carfelian woodworker. Seth stared back at the spiral stairway again, eyes glancing downward to where the Forge families resided. The fish may be an issue without the threat dispersed. Madame Athel cleared her throat with a touch of annoyance, which, much to Seth's chagrin, was very good at snapping him out of his thoughts. Lord Cernier, your recent efforts in taking part of the daily activities of the Citadel have been wonderfully appreciated, but you must focus on the task immediately before you above all else. Do you think about management of the archive dusting duty when dealing with Carfelian requests? Of course not. It is simply a waste of precious effort. And what if the management of dusting duty might cause the death of said Carfelians? Seth turned his face down, embarrassed by the outburst. Apologies. Your report was excellent, so I was able to listen while thinking of other issues. She raised an eyebrow. Truly? Then what was the prime issue with the Carfelian musicians' offering, and how shall we respond? Seth thought for a moment, going over the words he'd heard only a few minutes ago. Yon Ivy Frenet wishes to play a tune of the Aurorian Empire, a Genranite ditty, as he put it, and so he's asked to have a musical sheet in Carfelian notation with which to learn. We do not know Carfelian notation, and so such a thing cannot be quickly procured. Madame Athel nodded, her annoyance allayed slightly as Seth continued. If possible, we should have one of the officers take an hour or two to teach the song directly, as we use the same instrument. Ivy doesn't use the wood pipes common to Carfelians, but the metal horn of our homeland. This way, notation can be bypassed. And if none of the officers are available due to other more important tasks, then we send Ivy a message detailing our thanks for his generous offer, but that we would rather hear the melodies of the Carfelians played upon the steel conch, as a measure of unification. Madame Athel smiled and sat back in her seat. It appears that you only appear distracted, then. In that case, you should practice in bettering your appearance and posture to provide assurance to those around you. Do you have any other comments in regards to the rest, and do you have a plan to deal with this Lake Wolf threat? She always knew just how to put her approvals in the most aggravating way possible. Seth matched her previous sigh with one of his own and responded. The rest of the report is entirely satisfactory. Any minor problems, aside from the deficiency of fish, can be dealt with in the typical way of rerouting Genranites within the boundaries of the schedule. As for the Lake Wolf threat, I will speak to the Forge families about whether or not they can create an improvement to the traps that were built decades ago. Once that's done, the fishing tournament will provide the fish. No need for alterations to the menu. Understood, Lord Cernier. As Madame Athel got up to leave, she raised a pointed finger. But do be careful when speaking to them. They can be proud, and it wouldn't do to have them hold a grudge. As she walked towards the entrance to continue monitoring the work of other tasks, Seth prepared himself, thinking on how to present his request. The fear of potential rebellion had not left him over the past few days, and it was what had kept him from visiting the clan of smiths and metalworkers who resided beneath this very floor. He had tried to bring it up at the evening meals, but his courage had been inadequate. Now, only a couple of weeks remained before the feast, and if he waited any longer, they wouldn't have enough time to finish any improved traps before it was too late. In the east wing of the citadel, near the outer walls towards the village border and the open fields, a stairwell descended down to the base of the fortress. Though not truly underground, it was still deep enough to be fairly dim even in the daylight hours, and quite cool to boot. The majority of the supplies for the citadel were kept in these colder rooms under the main halls, where Seth could see people moving to and fro, carrying meats and bottles to be used in tonight's meal. These were a sharp contrast to the other rooms further down under the west wing, the Aurorian forge rooms. It was always sweltering in there, even with an excellent ventilation system that could be set to pump the excess heat to many of the living apartments on the higher floors, or altered to release out into the open air during the warmer months. Even so, Seth wasn't sure if it was the heat or the meeting that caused him to wipe his brow as he stood before the imposing iron door. There were 3 of these rooms, each one dominated by a massive contraption of metal taller than his father had been, and as wide as the circular meeting table in the archives, which was large enough to seat 12 people. These marvels were the Aurorian forges themselves, capable of growing to immense heats with only a small handful of coal or wood. As such, they whispered less smoke than even the kitchen hearth. It was certainly a stark contrast to the old forges of Mist Bay, whose dark plumes were said to mix with the pale fog in a swirling dance over the waters. How the Aurorians were able to create such a wonder was a mystery, one whose answer was closely kept by the forge families themselves. All that, and the fact they had been built so quickly, was astonishing. The architect from Error must have been a true genius to have integrated all of these forges and protected doorways into this citadel so quickly, Seth whispered as he closed the door as softly as he could. If only I could have met him. A gravelly laugh behind Seth made him jump. But would you have been able to stand his bitter snips and shouts? Your father, Heinz rest him, could barely handle the codger, much less any of us lowly doldrums, as he used to call us. As Seth turned around, he saw the short yet taut form of the old forge master and chief metalworker Festus Staymorn, whose soot-splotched beard shook about with his rattling chuckle. As it had been a rather long time since Seth had set foot here, a proper first impression was necessary to re-establish the alliance in a positive manner. Seth smiled and nodded at Festus. The more spent on the bluster, the less blast can be bought. I'm sure he was a good servant of all the Genernites, despite his demeanor. He looked up at the Aerorite refinery, watching the slow glow pulsing through the windows. After all, this fortress and these constructs have remained sturdy and secure throughout the decades due to both his intelligence and your masterful skill in using them. We'd have been in dire straits long ago without such combined efforts. Festus chuckled alongside a few others behind him who approached upon hearing that their lord had arrived, and they exchanged a few knowing glances. Many of them looked intrigued at Seth's appearance, though the low red light of the forges cast a sinister crimson pall over their faces. They were so changed from how they looked when above ground that it gave him pause. Fortunately, as Seth read their faces and demeanors, that intrigue seemed to be born of opportunistic curiosity rather than a detached pitying. The necessity of this first impression only continued to grow. Even so, had Seth already made a grave mistake? He continued to hold a good-natured smile despite the immediate realization of his failure, as the old forge master turned back to him and spoke. Well, it seems you've finally grown into that honey tongue of yours. Tell me, young lord, what have you called a meeting here for? It can't simply be that you felt a will to personally praise us after so many years, and were more eager for a chance to push our skills and money bags than to listen to blithe cheers from our new benefactor. He should have known. The 3 forge-room families, as many in the Citadel called them, were tight-knit and to the point. They'd always been. Much of what they knew about smelting and metalworking had been passed down for generations, all the way back from when their ancestors assisted the Surnir clan in Mist Bay. Back then, they created impressive tools made of strong metal based on the ore that Seth's line would procure for them in the Emerald Hills, and in return, they were paid handsomely by the Surnirs as the merchant lords would sell the finished products at a remarkable value. Though the exact nature of that value had changed around a bit, the respect between the Surnir clan and the forge-room families had never faltered in each generation, especially after Lord Surnir I purchased the powerful forges and refineries from the Aurorians when the citadels were being built. That very same respect was now in greater jeopardy than Seth had realized. He needed to act more like his father. Stand up straight, speak with intent, be gracious yet commanding. Of course, such niceties only serve to waste both our time. Seth shifted his stance to take on a less pleading and more steadfast air. If only his small frame could pull off such a position with greater conviction. I've come to request your aid to put an end to a scourge on the valley, this dire lake wolf who threatens the peace of the celebrational feast. A murmur spread through the crowd as Festus raised his eyebrows in interest. A lake wolf, eh? Well, don't we have 8 different traps of steel that were built for the very purpose of capturing those beasties? Are you saying they've somehow failed to do so, then? Be careful, Seth thought to himself as he gave his most cordial smile. That your ingenious traps have lasted for 30 years without flaw or error is already worthy of legendary records. The case today is that rather than fail to hold a beast, your traps have met a creature with intellectual capacity greater than any in written history. Festus's smothered grin had continued to grow, though Seth wasn't sure whether it was mocking or genuine through his squint. The other metalworkers had faces of iron, some of them literally with their protection masks, but Seth could tell that there was some sort of emotion building. Had he made a mistake? No time to think about that. Changing tactics now would be seen as weakness. This lake wolf has not broken or bent your metal, but attained the creativity of humans to open the latches with its jaws, paws, or fins. We have yet to see it do so directly, but its tracks do not lie. As such, we require that you create a new cage, one that can only be opened by a human's wit and hands alike. Payment will be appropriately meted out to all of the Forge families for this important act. There, that had to be enough. Unless they would refuse due to Seth's failure to rule in the years leading up to this moment, or if they had already made secret deals with the outskirt stewards to shift the location of their forges, or if they were insulted that... Festus shook his head. Seth's heart sank, and he began to say something, anything that might save the situation. Before he could get a single word out, Festus and the rest of his brethren began to laugh.
Oh, you've really set us on pure emerald pedestals, Lord Cernier. It sounds to me that we've continued to offer our crafts without flaw, as these newly failed designs of those snap traps you've glorified were made by old Error's engineers. We simply supplied the materials and construction, which continue to last through our care and upkeep.
Festus gave a sly wink brimming with intent.
As I'm sure you've gathered, this is a very important trade secret between our families and our families alone.
The shock, relief, and embarrassment that Seth felt at that moment were in nearly equal measure. What they had revealed was certainly not common knowledge by any means, and through a stroke of luck it had caused there to be no insult given through Seth's request. Nevertheless, such a detail, secretive though it might have been, was something that Seth should have been aware of as Lord long ago. Festus continued.
So if you've got some sort of old Aurorian design up there in your fancy hold of writings, we'll be able to make it. If not, then there won't be much we can do to improve it without knocking some sort of apparatus out of use. They may have been a fancy folk, but even they leave behind cracks in the walls.
I see. Were the capabilities of the Genernites so far below that of the architects of Error? Even as he thought so, he realized it was far simpler than that. As the Lords of Mistbay, his family had known how to purchase exactly what they needed, while the Forge families were exceptional at crafting basic materials such as ingots and solid tools, not thinking up strange contraptions with dozens of moving parts. As you were then. Forgive my intrusion. As the metalworkers dispersed, returning to their stations with a laughing smile on their faces, Seth still couldn't tell whether it was out of pleasure or mockery. Probably a bit of both. Why were they so hard to read compared with everyone else in the Citadel? Did his father have trouble as well?
Don't worry yourself, Lord Cernier.
Festus stroked his tightly ribboned beard, and it bobbed a bit. It certainly didn't seem like he had trouble reading Seth.
Though you spoke in haste and ignorance, it certainly left us all feeling rather chuffed. Though we can't make a brand new creation, we would be able to create a slightly larger trap of the same sort, if such a thing would please the young lord.
If it wouldn't be too much trouble for you, I would gladly accept such a thing. If this lake wolf is as large as the reports say, it may be necessary to lure it in.
We'd like it to be trouble. As I said, it's been too long since we were challenged.
Right, I think I understand.
And those who rise to the challenge deserve special encouragement, eh?
Festus looked at Seth expectantly, and Seth nodded. Yes, your families will be granted a greater share in the quota's return, as well as special recognition during the celebrational feast, provided that you do rise to aid us in this.
I'll accept that. Farewell, Lord Cernier.
Seth nodded and turned around to leave, feeling a little discouraged. He was running out of safe ways to deal with this threat. There might be something in the far reaches of Ser Giorno's experimental gardens that could be used to poison the bait and dispose of the troublesome lake wolves even after they escape the traps, though losing those fish-like beasts as a source of essential food for the Citadel would be quite painful. But was there any other choice? Thinking about this possible strategy gave Seth another realization, and he whispered to himself, Besides all that, I forgot that Eldred had invited me to check on the progress of the gut tree last month. Festus snapped his fingers and hurried over to Seth.
If you'll pardon the request, while you're in that garden, let me know how the little machine he requested yesterday is doing.
Hein's teeth, he had good hearing.
Sir Eldred said he needed it for an esserweed or something like that, but I haven't heard anything since. I know he's Madame Athel's son, but greedy requests like that go beyond our natural generosity.
Seth nodded with a sigh. Understood. I hope it wasn't too difficult to make.
His little plant workshop is pretty wide, isn't it? So we just gave him one of our old spares to borrow. Better that than having our prime smelter come back waterlogged and rusted again. I didn't even know that Architect Rensalio's tools could have that happen with all the protective measures he added.
As Festus said those words, a question that had been lying dormant in Seth's mind leapt to the forefront. Protective measures? Was there a signature element of security that the Aurorian architect built into all of his creations?
What? No, I was just saying that they were all fairly foolproof. Though I suppose if the fool is smart enough, even that can be bypassed.
Seth took a deep breath in the stifling air, eyes wide. Would such a feature be included into the bronze doors that guard the lowest floor of the citadel? With your knowledge of the architect, do you know if he intended they be sealed forever after enough wrong guesses?
Of course the doors can't be sealed forever. When would that ever be needed? If foes attacked, they could always dig out the walls around it or simply batter it in. All it would do is seal away the owner's access, if some wretch saw fit to do so, even if the password was unknown. Besides, I don't recall Rensalio being too keen on building those things anyway. Part of the bitter snips against the old lord I mentioned. I doubt he'd add such a complex function.
How simple he made it sound. And yet it made logical sense, or at least it was sense that Seth desperately desired to be so. Regardless, the bronze gates were not dangerous to test. Thank you, Master Festus. I apologize for my former lack of knowledge and appreciation for the work and loyalty of the Forge families.
No need for it, young lord. Be on your way again, then, and allow me back to my work.
Seth bowed and hurried out of the now sweltering forge room. More worries that had been allayed than not, but the dire lake wolf threat loomed ever further. On top of that, the fact that almost all of the technological capabilities of the Citadel were reliant on the knowledge passed down from the dead Aurorian Empire, and that this knowledge would dwindle rather than grow as the years passed by was concerning. Seth took a deep breath of the refreshingly cool air of the lower rooms as he walked to clear his head. That was something to worry about in the future. If Ser Gierno didn't have something to help deal with the present threat, it would scarcely matter anyway. The gardens that lay just between the walls and tower of the citadel were wonderfully beautiful, whether that beauty was found in the form and order of the dozens of rows and plots which grew medicinal herbs and food of all sorts, or in the colorful and varied foliage that gave off a sweet scent, especially with many of the plants now approaching their ripest points. Though most of the valley had already finished bringing in their harvests, the citadel's warmth preservation techniques and unique flora from the north enabled the Generanites to grow exotic goods unseen anywhere else in the valley. Many of the most precious were kept in an Aurorian-made shed, a structure clear as glass, yet sturdy as stone which remained warm even in the depths of winter. The schedule made it clear that at least one of each plant gifted by the old empire was always to be grown there, even if some sprang up like weeds, leaving filling yet tasteless fruit that was best suited for beasts. Well, even if the raising of the Carfilians' quota didn't work, at least the Generanites wouldn't starve. Seth passed by the southern garden, one of the 4 quadrants, and smiled at the thick greenery of the root vegetables being watered for what was probably one of the last times this year. It seemed there would be a good harvest once again, all thanks to the specific planting diagrams and instructions laid out in the schedule. That being said, there was an odd but calming scent about, almost like a mixture of charcoal and spices. Seth considered asking a gardener about the unusual smell. Perhaps there was a small roasting going on nearby that could be enjoyed while he was visiting. Before he could think about it any further, Seth turned the corner and stopped in shock as the scent intensified. He had been quickly answered by the only section of the gardens excluded from the bounds of the schedule, as a stream of billowing gray smoke rose from amidst a strange garden surrounded by piles of blackened wood. It came from Sir Eldred Gierno's botanical laboratory. "Fire! Fire in Sir Eldred's garden!" Seth's cry rang out across the whole of the quadrant as he ran to the water depository near the eastern wall, nearly stumbling in his haste. Almost immediately, some gardeners joined him, carrying the containers they had just been using for watering and repeating his call. Seth stepped back from the sputtering spigot, his own pail now full, and called to a guard on the eastern wall who was gawking at the sight with an open mouth. "Sound a gong! We need more water bearers!" One of the gardeners, a young fellow by the name of Ernst, still had a full water pail, and he dashed straight for the small gray hut belching the smoke.
Sir Eldred sure burns him quickly. It was fine when I was here a moment ago. Good timing, Lord Cernier.
Though this was an immediate threat of potentially immense proportions, Seth couldn't help but feel oddly relieved. So many were springing into efficient action, and as the yellow gong sounded out a ringing chime, more would ensure a swift return to normalcy. Matters of sudden excitement weren't too uncommon around the botanical laboratory, and Elle adapted quickly, but Seth still needed to make sure the General Knight was safe regardless. "Ernst, you must shield yourself with this water." The gardener hesitated as he heard Seth shout, before flinching as the cold contents of Seth's pail splashed over him. "Now do the same for Sir Gierno inside." Ernst nodded in understanding and barreled to the doorway, preparing to fling the contents of his pail forward after breaking through. But just as he reached it, the door swung open and a loud shout of, "Wait! It's under control!" sounded as the portly form of Sir Eldred Gierno met poor Ernst with a calamitous collision that flung the young man back several feet to the ground, soaked for a second time by the water in his own pail. Eldred recovered quickly, taking half a moment to adjust his glasses as Seth felt a mixture of concern for the stunned gardener and relief at Sir Gierno's safety. "As I was saying, it's all under control. Please don't throw water in here, it won't douse the essence weed anyway." He got up from where he had fallen and caught his breath. "I just didn't estimate how much extra smoke there'd be correctly, that's all. The little flora smolders like a dragon in heat." At these words, Seth had run up to the doorway, helping Ernst up along the way, while everyone else had slowed to a stop, glancing towards the plume of spice-scented darkness incredulously. However, Elle seemed to be right, as the smoke was already lessening at a relaxing rate. Seth breathed a long sigh of relief and turned to everyone in the garden. "Thank you, and well done all. Since Sir Gierno has confirmed there is no danger now, you may return to normalcy. Your bravery and quick acting will be noted, I assure you. Ernst, you especially. Can you move?" "Yep, just got the wind knocked out of me." "That's good. Go in and get yourself warm, preferably somewhere not as smoky." "You got it, Lord Cernier." The gong had stopped, and those in the garden were explaining the situation to any latecomers. All's well that ended without utter inferno, Seth supposed. Now, as for what happened, Elle. "Right. Sorry about all that. The fire duster has been fully put out, so there shouldn't be any more contenders for Lord Hind's belching contest today." Elle rushed back inside the spacious hut, waving away the last vestiges of hazy but savory smoke reminiscent of the legend of the Emperor King's feast. "Essence weed tests. The stuff gives a good bit of relaxation when mixed with tea, so I wanted to see if I could purify it with the Forge family's inventions. As it turns out, too much dry heat makes it smoke something fierce." Seth blinked in confusion. "A fire duster refinery? That's what you requested from Festus? Why would you need something that melts metal for a plant?" "To be honest, I was in a hurry, and I figured it would be better than waiting an hour for the grass to fully disintegrate. Plus, this thing also prevents any contamination from other materials which comes with traditional fires, as the chamber superheats separately from the fuel source. It's been especially useful for purifying liquid floral elements, which have been the only things to provide anything substantial so far, by the way. But before I talk about that, I want to know just how you took such swift action. It must have been 30 seconds at most after the smoke broke free of the lab. Quite commendable, despite its unnecessary result." Eldred continued to speak as he moved between each table and plot, checking for signs of damage, and Seth tried to follow as best he could, careful to avoid touching any odd fronds or vines. "If I didn't know better, I would have assumed you had appointed a spy to watch over me day and night. Did you leap right off the archive lookout and fall all the way down here just to be the first on the scene?" Eldred chuckled at his own jab, and Seth frowned. "Not quite, but assigning someone to rein you in may end up being necessary at this rate. Though I imagine you'd kill them from worry before the first week of their tenure was over." He sighed, shaking his head. "I could swear that at least one of the High Keepers has picked you as his favorite." The General Knight scoffed. "That, or our gods can't stand the thought of having me end up in their realm so soon, what with all my unbridled potential. Speaking of which..." Eldred ran over to the far side of the building, skirting past other plants with practiced agility. Seth followed with much greater care. How Elle was always able to maintain such energy was a mystery to the easily winded lord. "Here we are! I wanted to show the gut tree, like I mentioned a couple weeks ago, but it may have been better that you waited until now." He had stopped before a gray-colored tree that reached almost to the glass-paneled roof 12 feet above. A couple of the branches were a much lighter color than the rest, a clear sign of being grafted on, but even their differing hue was fading fast. At the ends of these grafted branches were strangely bulbous fruits of cloudy silver. Sir Giorno patted the tree as one would a friend's back.
"This one's been doing better than any other. As Stonegut has no seeds to speak of, just a fleshly thick mass of animal-like matter that is as dry as Lady Safe's mouth by the time I get it, I slowly introduced cut-up chunks of the stuff within the earth at the base of the various trees I was testing it with. It was a long shot, and just one hypothetical method of many I was testing, but it managed to cause little silver bulbs to grow on the stalks."
Seth pointed at the unnatural fruits. "Are these the silver bulbs, then? They do seem to be growing rather well here."
"Yes, but it's not the tree they were born on. Quite unfortunately, whenever one of these stonegut bulbs grew, the rest of the tree beyond the branch withered and died."
Seth glanced through a window at one of the blackened brush piles outside. Fire had not been the source of their destruction after all.
El continued. "I was able to save the stone seeds by cutting these branches off the dying tree, and to my surprise, the branches themselves remained alive as if they'd become their own plant. The stone seeds didn't grow at all, but they somehow seem to be keeping the branch itself alive, as it shrivels into dust when the seeds are removed. Those silver drops are like a plant's heart, or its core, except plant hearts and cores don't exist anywhere else in nature. You'd think they would be a contradiction of Lady Tora's ancient works, unless they're simply a heretofore undiscovered advancement of it yet."
Seth rubbed his chin. "If they aren't a product of nature, are you saying that our ancestors, or spirits, created them through some form of forgotten magic, like in the stories?"
Now, don't go putting words in my mouth. I simply meant that this is still a new branch of research which goes beyond what we have written down. Nothing like this has been found outside of the Carfelian Valley, so it might have something to do with the mineral makeup."
He smiled.
"Though the thought that the spirits of the old stories are actually creating little caches of delicious goodies for us in the mountains is fun, no one has actually proven the physical existence of their kind in history, and even sightings haven't been claimed that much for as long as I've been alive."
He chuckled.
"Cryptozoology and mythology are two separate endeavors after all, though it's easy to mistakenly see overlaps."
Seth thought about that for a moment. There were nearly hundreds of the old tales that referred to strange beings that ignored the typical rules of existence itself. Some considered these elusive spirits emissaries of the High Keepers. Others said they were nothing but children's fancies who primarily appeared before the most innocent and cruel of humankind. But there was nothing substantial in all of the archives that these creatures were real. No, to jump to superstition when faced with the unknown was the mark of a fool. "Right, my apologies. As you were saying about these contradictory flora."
"I suppose my point is that they aren't typical plants or mushrooms. They could be some secret horticultural art of the Carfelians, or even some sort of mineral arrangement that they have in their minds rather than a naturally occurring thing. However,"
Seth followed his trail of thought, "why in the world would they deceive us about such a thing? Already we can only gain stonegut from their efforts alone, so to go through with a fabrication like that would be pointless. It must just remain an oddity of nature for now." El nodded.
"Precisely. Because of that reasoning, I continued onward with my attempts to unite traditional dendrology with the stonegut. I had just managed to successfully graft these two branches onto this ghostwood sapling here, when I received the fresh stonegut from that forager 2 weeks ago. I began to water it with a solution made from the juice of the newly plucked stonegut. The liquid is still swirling with life, and far more potent than dead chunks, you see. And to my surprise, the branches grafted more fully than ever before, and the seeds began to swell and grow more into the shape of a fully formed stonegut."
"I see. So this is why you didn't call for me over and over in the past couple of weeks after I failed to arrive. There was a continuous change, and you wanted to be able to provide a complete report. I take it that it is still changing even now."
"Yes, though the report is ready to be written today. The seeds are nearing maturity, and if it weren't for one deeply disconcerting thing about the current state of the plant, I would have them ready for the celebrational feast. Unfortunately, due to this oddity, I don't believe it to be fit for human consumption."
Eldred picked up an empty vial and held it underneath the seed on the right. He struck it once with a firm knock, and immediately a thick black ichor began to secrete from the top of the seed near where it was affixed to the branch. Seth stepped back in alarm, but El continued to remain still, waiting until the ichor flowed down into the vial. The stuff was strange, almost pulsing as it descended with a vigor that reminded Seth of an insect's flailing, but it stilled, and the seed stopped producing the liquid after a couple moments. The remainder dripped down into the vial, filling it with about 3 measures, per the numerals on the instrument side. "I've never seen such a thing from any stonegut. What is it, El?"
"I'm not quite sure myself,
but it has a peculiar effect upon creatures like ourselves. Seth looked aghast at El. Don't tell me you ingested this slime. It looks about as evil as any substance could be. Please, even someone as courageous as myself knows not to do something so foolhardy. I made sure to dilute a bit of it in a gallon of water before taking a sip. How in the world could this reckless devil have come from the same clan as Seth? The young lord closed his eyes. If I were informed I was speaking to a ghost, I would be inclined to believe it. You know, given the onset of exhaustion I felt afterwards, I won't say that it was an absolute impossibility. However, it did give me the knowledge that this stuff drains away your wakefulness unlike anything I've ever seen. After a solid meal, I was back to normal, but it was certainly a striking contrast to the energizing stone gut it should have been. He gestured to a basin nearby where a fish slowly swam about. I also gave a diluted version to that trout while it was in a rather large trough, and it took the little guy a few days before he woke up, so I'd say it works pretty well. Seth stared at the sinister vial. This can be disposed of safely, I hope. If this were to somehow get into the wells, or even transform into some sort of smoke, it could be devastating. El sighed. You always think only about what could go wrong. Imagine the possibilities of what this could do when refined properly. It could become the best weapon against insomnia the world has ever seen. At the cost of potentially entering a sleep without end. The same could be said of any medicinal herb if enough is ingested. El set the vial down carefully onto a small labeled stand. How about this proposition? I promise not to do any excessive experiments with it. It shall be kept far away from any system of water that could endanger humans in the valley. I won't drink any more myself until it is safely tested, and you shall not find any gaseous aura of comatose cloud anywhere in the valley. In return, will you allow me to continue working to refine this material into something useful? Surely even you can imagine at least one way it would be a benefit for us. He grinned. If you are worried about every eventuality, then imagine if some beasts with skins of stone were ever to show up in the valley, bellies growling and demanding a feast of flesh. Such a formula would neutralize them without invoking any aggression tactics, and all while enabling you to retain that cliff-high morality of the Cernier clan, eh? An idea flashed through Seth's mind at those words, and he reprimanded himself for forgetting why he was visiting the gardens in the first place. Say, El, how easily could you create a solution that would work as a sauce of sorts? One that would send anyone who partook of something it covered into a deep slumber. Eldred blinked a couple of times. Seth, are you feeling all right? It's not normal for someone to change their values entirely in a matter of moments. Right, apologies. I should have mentioned this right away, but I forgot upon seeing the smoke. There is a fiendishly intelligent lake wolf on the prowl, one who has somehow learned how to open our traps. This flawed stone gut liquid would be perfect for such an operation, so long as it can be integrated into the bait. Eldred grinned. Well, that sounds like the perfect excuse to test the effects of a full dosage while saving the valley. You'll have your sauce prepared before bedtime. Are you sure about that? The sun has already begun to set. To tell the truth of it, I already had an extra vial ready to go for testing purposes, but I didn't have a proper target yet. Just so you won't lose any sleep, I'll mention that I certainly had no intention of tasting it myself. It appeared that more lives than just the Lake Wolf's prey may have been saved by Seth's visit. In any case, the celebrational feast is in less than a month, so we'd best begin as soon as possible. Meet us in the Great Hall as the sun reaches the mountains. Righto, Lord Cernier. Seth began striding out of the laboratory as Eldred began searching through the shelves for some of the necessary chemical ingredients. This meeting would involve the Citadel Guards and the Forge families, so their leaders, alongside Madame Athel, needed to be gathered. Fortunately, there were still several people who had remained around the hut even after the all-clear had been given, each trying to get a glimpse of what was going on inside. Some of them jumped as Seth stepped out, and they listened as he commanded. I require Captains Trevin and Valmir, as well as Forge Master Stamorn and Madame Athel to meet me in the Great Hall. A course of action has been made. After a slight moment of confusion, a couple guards and a gardener began stumbling away over the dirt, while shouts of, "Yes, sir," filled the air. By the time they had regained their footing on the couple paths, Seth was already on his way to the Great Hall again. How invigorating it was to have a plan in mind. It granted an energy and assuredness unmatched by any meal. Nevertheless, he had to be careful. Though this strategy was almost certain to work, overconfidence could blind him to other unforeseen concerns. Seth had gotten his emotions well in check by the time the rest had appeared from the doorways on either side of the hall, and he waved them to sit down at the side of the table closest to the stairwell. Festus had cleaned up a bit, and the fading sunlight through the windows gave him a far less fearsome appearance than the fiery glare of the forge rooms. In fact, without the mask and soot marks, he looked less like the productive leader of the metalworkers, and more like a kindly elder who was only interested in telling stories to his grandchildren. Even so, he sat down and kicked his feet upon the neighboring chair in a casual flourish.
"Well, young lord, it's scarcely been more than a triplet of hours since we've spoken. Presumably you've found something useful in those gardens."
Sergiano slammed his hands down on the table dramatically, almost causing Festus to fall off the chairs in surprise.
"Yes, he did. I present to you, fine gentlemen, and my gracious mother, the newest creation of the valley."
He pulled out a new vial from his vest, one with fancy curves along the side of the bottle that made it look like a miniature version of the Citadel Tower.
"It's the bane of wakefulness and lake wolves everywhere, the freshly squeezed juice of a transplanted and grafted stone-gut bud."
According to the minor tests he performed, this has the opposite result of eating stone gut. Rather than give energy, it siphons it away so quickly that it sends the one who ingested it into a deep slumber. I would pray these tests you speak of did not include yourself as a subject, Eldred, but I am not so naive. Madame Ethel crossed her arms and glared at her son. Isn't there some other way to ensure your work remains outside the realm of idiocy? Leave it to her to distract Seth's announcement by saying something he agreed with wholeheartedly. Well, yes, El's methods are certainly questionable, but it is possible that such an issue will never arise again after this mission. If this beast can be captured alive, it will make for a wonderful test subject. Captain Trevin narrowed his eyes.
"So you intend for us to use such a tactic against the beasts? You should know they are wise creatures, and if there is any hint of poison in their food, they are willing to refuse until starvation would claim them."
Before Seth could respond, Valmir picked up the bottle and uncorked it, taking a careful sniff.
"It smells like nothing but well water to me."
He raised it to his lips, and an immediate pulse of shock and fear swept through Seth. Was the old man drunk? Both Sergiano and the young lord leapt up and screamed, "Don't!" But as the word left their mouths, Valmir had already set it down with a laughing grin, not a drop in his mouth.
"Sorry, lordships. Forgive an old man his flying fancies."
Sergiano was already laughing and congratulating the soldier on his joke, while Seth tried to calm his heart as Valmir continued.
"If it's all as scentless as that vial, there should be no issue in getting those lake wolves drunk on this stuff."
Was Seth cursed to have everyone around him try to induce palpitations whenever they could? That's good to hear, but please never do that again. Valmir nodded his apologies to Seth and leaned back in his chair, still chuckling a little. Captain Trevin looked down at his fellow guard with a glance of distaste at the joke, but remained silent. Madame Ethel sighed. Lord Cernia's concern alone wouldn't have been enough, but as it elicited a yell from Eldred, it must be especially powerful indeed. She accentuated this snide remark with a glance at Seth. However, if the new tool is so dangerous, why is this meeting not confidential? You know that the Round Table of the Archives is the place for such things. I don't see why a new strategy to combat beasts should be hidden away, Seth continued, trying to regain his composure with a placating smile. After all, it would already be known to everyone once the expedition begins, and I imagine that the Carfelians and outskirt stewards alike would be pleased to make use of it for their own defensive purposes against similar beasts.
"If we have the capacity to hold them," Festus grinned. "Fortunately for you, young lord, we were able to come up with specific alterations in the length of certain parts of the cages, so we should have your special trap ready by morning's light."
Truly, you said it would be a challenge.
Aye, and a challenge it will be to get it done so quickly, but we're confident that the fruits of our work shall be met with success and closer standing, eh?
The ulterior motive so apparent in Festus's words didn't matter to Seth, as such swift results could only improve the chances of ending this threat in time. Your price will be named and met. Thank you, Master Seymourn.
The guards will be prepared to leave by first shimmer of dawn as well. This beast will be brought to you alive and ready for proper examination.
Captain Trevin tapped the ground with his spear.
Beneath this very room lies one of our armories. It shall be cleared, and the receptacle upon the floor shall be altered into a pit, where even this lake wolf will be forced to remain subservient.
Madame Ethel glanced at Seth again. This time a warning flashed in her eyes. Seth understood immediately. The balance of appreciation must be maintained. Thank you, Captain Trevin. The honor of the Mist Bay heroes would be granted upon such a quarry, one administered upon the arrival of the celebrational feast, so that all the valley would know of your valor.
You don't have to worry about getting me anything, Seth, Sergiano said as he sealed up the vial. I just want the results of how this stuff affects something when it isn't diluted at all.
Will it enter a sleep without end? Will it wake up, or will it simply pass away? Oh, and if it wakes up eventually, does it need food and water during its rest? There's so much to learn from this. Seth nodded and stood up. So it's decided then. At first light tomorrow, we shall meet here for a final briefing. Madam Athel, will you be able to have the chefs save an especially succulent section of the meat for bait tomorrow? It will be done. She bowed, and the guards followed her lead. Stamorn gave a quick salute as he walked away, and Sir Giarno patted Seth on the back before sprinting out the door. All is in place. It has to be, Seth thought as he moved out of the way for the table to get set for the nighttime feast. Even so, he knew that this night wouldn't be too restful. As the morning light struck the silver tower of the citadel, causing it to shine like a beacon on the edge of a sea, Seth looked out over the sand of the training ground and the gate leading to the village beyond it. The scant sleep he'd had scarcely left his eyes, and yet he was already wide awake. He stepped into the middle of the training ground, where several guards stood at attention, though their yawns betrayed their current moods. "Slack not and order yourselves! Our lord stands before us!" Captain Trevin was dressed in fairly showy and decorated garb, though Volmir had mentioned that it was actually some of the better equipment in the citadel. Each of the guards held a spear, their tips sharpened and their length well over 7 feet long, which all now found firm stock against the dirt as they quickly tried to follow their leader's orders as best they could. "No worries, Captain," Seth smiled. "They'll need all the rest they can get." Soon, 4 metalworkers and Festus stepped out of the doorway of the citadel tower, each holding the corner of an impressively sized trap, nearly 2 feet taller than the others. Closely following were many others, all excited to see the send-off. "Make way, please! Secret weapon coming through!" Sir Giarno pushed through the crowd until he was standing at the forefront. Closely following was Madame Athel and Margie, the latter holding a large sack of something that issued a delicious scent. Despite the solemnity that Seth felt at this moment, it was rather dulled by the lively chatter and curiosity that abounded around him. Did no one else feel concerned that this plan might fail, or was their faith in Seth and the others so strong? If so, then the slight additions to the plan that Seth had devised last night would only bolster that faith. "I'd rather not underestimate these beasts again." Seth tapped on the unlatching handle of the trap. "Especially since we may not have time for a second chance before the feast. If the lake wolf opens this trap with its mouth, then can we have these handles drenched in the solution as well? Perhaps even attach a sponge on it soaked with the stuff. In the event that it has the forethought to have its underlings test the dangers of the trap first, then even lacing the bait with our weapon will have no effect." Festus stroked his beard. I don't see why not, provided we have enough of that sleep juice." "It's called Dream Draft, and that we do. I'd say we've nearly a gallon in total, and that much could probably make even Lord Hines woozy." Eldred presented another 2 vials from under his vest and tossed them over to Captain Trevin. "Be careful!" Seth shouted as they flew through the air and landed perfectly in Captain Trevin's outstretched hand. The guard began tying a cloth around the handle with a raised eyebrow towards Seth, who sighed. Just pass them normally next time, please." Fortunately, the rest of the planning and preparation went without further frights, and by the time the morning light was shining down upon all the valley, it illuminated a cage armed with the power to restrain and capture any creature of the lands within the Carfelian peaks. Metal bars smelted to become one unbreakable object, a wondrous smell pouring from the hunk of perfectly seasoned meat, all with an invisible and potent power laced over every manipulatable inch of it. "It will only take us 3 days, Lord Sernir. On the night of that 3rd day, ensure a true feast, one not sodden by dream draught, is well prepared for us, for we shall either return that night with our prey or not at all." Captain Trevin began his march at the head of the guards, and Seth waved them off as cheers sounded from the growing crowd of Genernites, Arorites, and Carfelians alike. However, he silently wished that the guards' words hadn't been so fate-tempting, especially with the worrying news that had arrived last night. After they passed out of sight of the crowds, Seth continued to watch the guards from the watchtower as they traveled north, directly towards the forest across the river where the sighting had occurred yesterday evening. It had been far too close, as the ones who had reported it were a few of Moni and Mari's friends from beyond the citadel. Carfelian children. If even a single one had been hurt, their blood would be on Seth's hands forever. Though they insisted through the officer's translation that the beasts had been hundreds of feet away, that was still hundreds of feet too close. Somehow, the Carfelian parents hadn't believed their children, stating that the citadel dwellers had the lake wolf population under control. It was surprising that some of the Carfelians held so much trust in them, and Seth was determined to ensure that this trust was not misplaced. Still, even the trust of the village Carfelians was not as surprisingly refreshing as the fact that Moni, Mari, and the other children of the Citadel had found friends among the Carfelian youth. Though they didn't know each other's language, they apparently had a shared bond in exploring the edge of the village together. Whether that bond could eventually reach the adults, well, such hopes were best left to the far future where they belonged, at least until this threat was dispelled. As he watched the last of the 7 guards appointed for the mission disappear among the northern trees, Seth closed his eyes and remained standing upon the watchtower of the citadel for a while longer. He had done all he could, and even so, there was a chance not all of the guards would return unharmed. Captain Trevin still had too much of the unnecessary fire of the past, but if Seth only had the power to temper it, then simply tempering it is what he would do. To regret and dwell on the choices made up to now would be pointless, as would needlessly worrying about the hunting party. He knew this, and yet he still couldn't help thinking about how he might be able to assist them. He finally let out a long breath and entered the archives. It had been an exhausting few days, and while delving into some of his favorite historical tomes would be an excellent way to both refresh himself and distract from his concern, there was still preparations for the celebrational feast to complete. As he passed by the portraits, Seth wondered if his father had ever set aside time for relaxation, and if so, what was it that he did? Surely it was something that would continue to uphold the prosperity and upkeep of the citadel, like training the guards, or perhaps traveling the valley to cull any issues that would arise. It couldn't have been anything as useless as indulging in the same tales of the past over and over again. Even if reading the tomes was somewhat useful for learning how to rule or to deal with certain issues, Seth cursed how horribly he had spent his time for the past several years. Best not to think about it for now. As he began to descend the stairs, he resolved to match the efforts of the guards, and all the others who continued to keep order running in the citadel. So long as he didn't collapse, he would continue to act as a lord until all was well in the valley. Even if he couldn't imagine attaining the strength of his father, he would strive to act like it until they returned. Maybe that was the only way he wouldn't feel guilty at their death, if such a horrible event were to occur. He shook his head to clear it once and for all. On the 3rd night, everything would bear fruit or come crashing down. It was as simple as that. Even the pursuit of his father's secret was somehow intertwined now, as Seth felt that even if he could find it, failing to end this lake wolf threat would show that even such a powerful tool would still be useless in his hands. The days passed with both incredible speed and unbearable sluggishness at the same time. There were so many kinds of events and elements of the celebrational feast to prepare, and though each was approved or altered relatively quickly, every second could be the moment that the beast had been captured, or the exact time a guard's throat was torn apart by the scaled creatures, and Seth would never know until they returned. Nevertheless, he could feel himself speaking with greater ease to every Carfelian or Arorite who came to him with a question or concern. Madame Aethel had stopped badgering him with pointed words as often, and his stomach no longer held as much of an immaterial lump as it had in the past. By the time Seth had started to understand the origin of such a feeling, the end of the 3rd day arrived, and already a commotion was stirring in the village. Officer Dorium had delivered the official news first. "Captain Hinolt Trevin and all of his men have returned. They request that you see their gift for yourself, Lord Cernier." Seth was already halfway across the drawbridge beyond the citadel gate by the time he caught sight of them, and a laugh of relief broke free from him. Captain Trevin was striding triumphantly through the village square, while dozens of Carfelians stared in amazement. He held 2 poles of the cage at once, while 4 other guards struggled to keep up on the other side, and within it stood the biggest lake wolf Seth had ever seen. Its curved array of jagged fangs were fierce as they snapped back and forth, and the emerald blue sheen of its scales shone in the sun like a lord's coat, flashing brighter than any other as it paced and struggled, gurgling in a lower pitch than Seth imagines such a creature could make. "Hail, Lord Cernier! The beast is apprehended, and victory is utterly ours!" Captain Trevin sounded happier than he'd ever been, and Seth felt utterly relieved. "I trust that our feast awaits us within." Of course. Well done, all of you." Before the gates closed behind them entirely, Seth caught a glimpse of the lake wolf staring at him, its eyes filled with a malice that felt somehow human. Seth shook his head at the notion as the gates shut. It must have just been the after-effects of the concern he'd been holding on to. He smiled, putting it out of his mind and focusing instead on the cheers of many, as the celebration in the citadel began. The feast had been prepared with great excitement and anticipation, serving as a practice for the upcoming celebrational feast for many of the citadel families. Arrays of steaming meats covered in rare garden spices, and arranged with many types of fruits were placed on each of the outward tables. Banners of many colors were emblazoned with poems, excerpts of some of the songs sung in Mistbay in honor of those who risked their lives to protect their homeland by the shores. They had been chosen since they would apply whether or not the guards had succeeded, but Seth was incredibly thankful that such a dismal failsafe hadn't been necessary. Almost everyone was swarmed around the guards who had ventured out, asking them questions and listening to the stories. Seth could tell that most of them were exhausted, specifically Voy and 4 others, but Captain Trevin seemed entirely in his element. He held one of his children with his left arm, while another was perched on his right shoulder, and he grasped a flagon of ale in the same hand.
And there we stood, awaiting the beast. The air hummed with both blood-sucking insects on a mad search for their last meal of the year, and of a fierce anticipation. Then it appeared. It led a pack of nearly 20, and it almost caught scent of us as it sniffed the air. We had positioned ourselves upwind, but Jeremy's late-night obsession with sausage still brought us to the brink of death.
Laughter passed through the crowd, and Seth smiled to see that as their appeasement and excitement grew, potential for rebellion from the guards also diminished.
They gathered about the cage, and the leering leader of the Lake Wolves forced a limping lackey into the opening. The door snapped shut, and we feared we'd have a fight in the open on our hands, but then the creature snatched the handle in its jaws, pulling it backwards and forwards, leaping up and yanking down. Drops of the dream draught flew about from the cloth around the handle, but most fell into the greedy thing's gullet. By the time he'd opened the door, it was already sluggish. After the meat was dragged out of the cage and the entire pack tore the fine roast to shreds, the beast began to shudder and trip. And even then, it remained standing long after every one of its underlings fell into a deep slumber. It tried to wake them, but it could do little more than give out one last obstinate and guttural howl before it too collapsed. As the body struck the ground, we sprang into action, using the length of our spears to move it into the cage it had avoided for so long. We were nearly back to the village before it stirred again with the approaching sunrise, but it was too late by then, for we had it in our power.
The crowd cheered, giving Captain Trevin yet another wave of applause. Sir Gierno rubbed his chin. So, getting about 2 spoonfuls of the dream draught put a 300-pound lake wolf to sleep for a few hours. If so, the rest of the beasts are likely still asleep, and will probably be so for a lot longer if they were the ones who primarily ate the meat. He was sitting at a table, surrounded similarly to Trevin by gardeners, elders, and other inhabitants, though their questions had been responded to by a focused silence from Eldred, who was scribbling on a small pad of paper while listening to the extravagant story. That is, if Captain Trevin is telling the whole truth, El. I'd wait until tomorrow morning, or maybe even the afternoon, depending on how well he holds his drink. Let him have this exaggeration, and we can get a proper report later. Seth patted Eldred on the back. Besides, you should be telling everyone about where they got the dream draft from. It was absolutely essential, so you should be gathering accolades as well. Thanks, but I'll have my praise from the living once it's perfected. Eldred stopped writing for a moment and gave an unusually soft chuckle. Though I'm sure our fathers are as pleased as can be at our performance these past few days. Seth nodded, smiling at the thought. Sieur Figuaro Gierno and Lord Cernier I had been incredibly close, practically full brothers to one another, and Seth was glad that their relationship continued on through their sons. I'm sure they are, though I'm certain yours is especially ecstatic. He was very interested in Lady Tora's work as well, if I've heard correctly. Eldred laughed. I should say so. He built the very garden I continue growing today. He passed away before I was old enough to really talk to him, but while my father hadn't much time for horticulture while in the position of royal aide, I've been told that he loved every second of it. Even now, I think about what sort of discoveries we could have made together. It was a lovely thought, but dwelling on that, and inevitably on the lost time Seth should have had with his own father, caused his heart to ache. He patted Eldred on the shoulder. Well then, we must strive to remember their lives and to make them proud today. And that's all we can do. Of course. Just imagine his pride when Dream Draft eventually allows every surgery accomplished here to be utterly painless. Seth sighed. I'd rather we continue simply not having many surgeries at all. Have it your way. Eldred gave him a thumbs up and went back to jotting down his probably useless notes of the story Captain Trevin was telling again. Now that the guard was on the 3rd iteration and the 5th flagon, the story had grown, involving a wrestling match with the beast before it fell into slumber, and so would likely continue to grow for as long as the night went on. Before long, Seth was called to again. Well, it seems our mastermind had witted theirs. Eh, your lordship? Velmir chuckled as he took another swig from his bottle. Sir Gierno certainly seems to have a knack for finding strange things of nature, yes. Unless you were referring to Master Stamorn or Captain Trevin. Valmir looked at him with confusion for a moment, then burst out with laughter.
I was referring to you, lad. Wasn't the plan yours to begin with?
Well, sort of. It isn't difficult to think of using a potent sleeping draught to ensure the safe capture of an animal when it's shown to you directly.
Ah, that's all right. Keep up the good work, your lordship.
Valmir snapped his fingers.
By the by, I've been hearing rumblings from the crowd about wanting a speech from our leader, like we used to have in the old days during big celebrations. Don't concern yourself if it's not as fiery as some of those. I prefer your methods with these sort of things.
Surely that was Valmir's way of trying to appease Seth. Even now, he still remembered the cheers that would arise after his father gave a rousing and boisterous speech at any celebration. Before melancholy took over his thoughts, he gave Valmir a wry smile. Why, does a loud noise bother your head? Such a curse would serve you right for overindulging.
I suppose that could be said.
Valmir took another swig before shaking his head.
Bah, who am I to say what you should do, Lord Cernier? Ignore this old man and do what you will.
Seth nodded to Valmir in farewell and began moving to the front of the room. He was right. A speech would be the proper way to celebrate this feast, so long as he didn't mess it up. Fortunately, there was too much intoxication about for such a thing to fully occur, or so he hoped. No. Regardless of how he felt, he needed to prove to himself that he could take such risks more frequently. It was how this victory had come about in the first place. In a strange twist, abandoning this line of thinking would be the true risk in this situation. Seth took a deep breath and stepped upon his sturdy chair, standing within view of the whole of the great hall. Everyone, might I have your attention, please? Among the many dozens in the hall, only a small handful noticed this announcement, notifying those around them in a way that would take an awkwardly long amount of time. Come on, what was he doing? Seth cleared his throat and spoke up. I wish to celebrate our heroes on this day, so hear me, one and all. That wasn't as loud as he had imagined it in his head, but it seemed suitable enough, as over half of the crowd looked towards him, and the rest fell quiet within the next few seconds. Here we go. Yes, to proclaim the deeds of our heroes who valiantly worked together to ensnare the threat to the entire valley, the beast who would be the bane of our upcoming celebrational feast. He looked over the crowd and felt his heart pounding. Had he never spoken to a large swath of his people at once, not even on the day he accepted his title as lord? The truth of that embarrassing notion struck at his confidence, but he forced it away. There was no going back now. Through the ingenuity of our forefathers, who provided such a home to prepare from, the guidance and intelligence of Sir Eldred Gierno and the gardeners who protected him, the will and steadfastness of Festus Stamorn and the Forge families, and the power and honor of the Citadel Guards, led by the indomitable Captain Hinolt Trevin, we have emerged victorious. The rhythmic thud of blood rushing through him only grew faster, or so it felt. With it rose a strange feeling of strength and certainty, and Seth leaned further into it, his voice growing in volume with every word. Not simply victorious, for we have mastered this lake wolf and captured it alive. We do not yet know the reason for why it has grown so large or so cunning, but we will. This grand beast shall be studied, and so the reason behind its intelligence and size may be discovered and harnessed for the good of all. Such is the glory of our citadel, of the Genernites who reign within. Seth raised his voice even further, and lifted both hands towards the champions of the day. So raise up a fitting cry of glory for Captain Trevin, Master Stamorn, and Sir Gierno, peacekeepers of the valley! A mighty shout of exuberance exploded from every corner of the great hall, and it continued long after Seth had sunk into his seat once more, the wave of adrenaline he'd experienced quickly fading. He smiled as he saw the fruits of his speech play out in the lifting up of the three he had referenced in a rather absurd spectacle. The spirit of the Citadel was strong today, and his speech had only bolstered it. A deep sense of pride and satisfaction flooded him, but before he could think any further about it, Madame Ethel's whispering voice snapped him back to reality. I know you have a crippling desire to avoid any recognition of your actions, but you should have included yourself as one of the peacekeepers in that speech. Even if an expedition had been sent out to deal with the threat of their own accord, Eldred's dream draft would never have been used, and the cage would have been far too small. It was only due to you focusing their attention onto that problem at hand. A leader who can see disparate odd occurrences all around him, and piece them together into a brilliant result like that is essential, but it will remain in everyone's mind only if you reveal to the people that you were the one behind it. Could she not, just for one night, give him unfettered praise? Seth narrowed his eyes. If you take issue with my words, Do you imply Father only spoke as he did for that reason, out of a weakness and fear that he would not be seen as the great lord that he was?" She crossed her arms. "Of course not. But to be a great lord and to be seen as one flow along the same stream of action. It doesn't matter immensely for now, I suppose, but that sort of perspective you create is exactly what will lead one to not simply be a peacekeeper, but the very reason peace exists in the valley at all. That revelation of your influence as a lord is needed to be worthy of such respect that your rule shapes the very will of the land. The events of the past few days are good steps in that direction, but you will need more if you are to attain to your father's uniting power. I expect these further steps to take place at the celebrational feast. The outskirt stewards need to see such a lord for themselves." "You believe that, as lord, my aim should be to act as the very key to peace in the valley." "Is that not what your father intended? He certainly believed that of himself, I can say that much." Seth remained quiet at that. The bronze doorway loomed large in his thoughts, and a new theory had formed to answer its question. The answer he imagined seemed impossible, and yet, with Madame Ethel's words, it very well could be the case. Before he could think about it further, he yawned. The exhaustion of worry and preparation had finally caught up with a vengeance. Even so, he should remain awake, stand as an example of diligence for all the Citadel to see. A reprimand from Madame Ethel woke him from his slumber quickly, and Seth realized that his head had been resting on the tablecloth without noticing. "It couldn't have been more than a couple of seconds. I'll be fine." She shook her head. "My lord, you should get some rest. Your speech has already been made, and you will need your strength for the morning. Accommodations for the outskirt stewards must be prepared." Seth rubbed the sleep from his eyes, but felt too drained to fight back. "As you wish. Continue the feast in my absence, but ensure that no one drinks themselves to oblivion." As he began to ascend the stairwell with as much dignity as he could muster, Seth could hear the whisper of his mother behind him. "Ever the caring, cautious soul. Blood has not diluted it." He shook his head. He was just hearing things in his fatigue. Soon he had reached his bed and quickly fallen into a deep and peaceful slumber beneath his father's portrait. The morning after was quiet, as many were still asleep from having had the chance to celebrate all night. Though the schedule had a certain number of days set apart for such extravagant feasts, perhaps it would be all right for more of them to be added. Seth decided against that after a moment of thought, though he smiled at the memory of last night. No, it was most likely the limited number of events that allowed for such pleasure to be had at every one, though the thrill of victory had especially flavored yesterday's. Well, now was as good a time as any to test his new theory, though Seth still felt a twinge of apprehension as he entered the descending passage at the end of the great hall. It wasn't long before he stood once more before the great gold-embroidered bronze doorway, the mechanical system that sealed it shut continuing to taunt him in silence. He closed his eyes, indulging in the pride and satisfaction he'd felt at the feast once more to drum up his courage. This was the sole place where his father's secret rested, itself the sole salvation of the valley if the outskirt stewards saw his bluster for what it was. It didn't matter if this input he was about to try was incorrect. Festus had assured him he would have as many chances as he needed. There was nothing stopping him from trying such an answer. No reason to obey the phantom fear pulling at his mind. He took a deep breath, and set the cylinders to first spell S, then E, then an alternate Fe, and ending with a small star symbol to signify the spelling of a royal title. There, that was how his name was written in Aurori Prime, and all that was left to do was to simply push. How much he should do so was still unknown, and it would be scarcely likely to work at all anyway, so only a small shove was necessary. Seth froze. His fingers had barely pressed against the metal when a great creaking sound emanated from the doorway, and it split down the middle. Two great doors of bronze opening wide into a deep passageway of pure darkness. The rush of cold and musty air that struck Seth was nothing compared to the emotion that had suddenly manifested in his gut. It was not joy or satisfaction as he had hoped, but the deep pit of sorrow that he'd feared. So his father had truly thought of him as the one who would be the key to peace in the valley. Not the might of the citadel and schedule, not the secret line hidden down the twisting passageways before him, not even the combined force of the valley's inhabitants, but Seth himself? And how was he fulfilling his father's will? Through constant fear, threats, deception, and weakness, all of which could cause everything to crumble in a moment. However, even as these thoughts threatened to overwhelm him, the events of the past few days pushed them back, and in the clashing tide rose a new realization. His father, Lord Sernir I, had trusted him to rise above his nature. Even back then, when Seth was an even weaker and more foolish child, his father had set this password. He had left this world assured that Seth could carry on his will, his legacy, in a way befitting a lord. Such a realization should be exactly what Seth had always wanted, and in so many ways it was. He took a step towards the open doorway, then paused. He was now on the very cusp of victory, but he just couldn't fully accept it. Not yet. Not until he had ensured peace for the whole valley once and for all in a way that could prove his father right. Seth took one last look at the depths of the tunnels. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could see a stairwell spiral down only a few feet from the doorway. The secret almost certainly lay at its bottom. He stared for another few seconds before looking away. No, he would only use it if absolutely necessary. His father had trusted him to uphold a way of peace, so he would not reach for this weapon yet. Instead, he would prove himself today and every day afterwards. To those of the village citadel, to the outskirts stewards, and even to all of the Carfelians. After all, if he knew where the secret lay hidden and he had the key to reach it, all that was left to do was to traverse the deep darkness and claim his prize whenever he was actually worthy of it, or whenever a threat to the valley was worthy of it instead. As he pulled the heavy doors shut with a resounding thud, he couldn't help but feel relieved even after everything. Despite his inadequacy to live up to his father's will in the past, he could now see a future in which that sorry fate was extinguished. The Lake Wolf threat had been dealt with, the celebrational feast was going off without a hitch, and even the outskirts stewards had been temporarily appeased, though not in a satisfying way. Seth thought about that last part a bit more. This tentative alliance would have to be changed as soon as possible. Instead of a relationship of mutual fear, he would try to open opportunities to build a more integrated valley together, showing them he was a lord who could bring forth a time of peace just like his father had established many years ago. His mind was racing, and even the limits of the schedule began to look less and less restrictive. It was possible he could go even further than the old alliance. There were still many regions in the far reaches where the Carfelians didn't live, and such places would make lovely Genranite towns without harming the delicate balance between everyone in the valley. He had almost reached the Great Hall as the initial plan was almost entirely formulated, and though the exuberance he had felt at the feast had been tempered, it was now steadfast. Nothing at all could shake it now. He had many resources to deal with a plethora of issues, and incredible allies who could accomplish anything they set their minds to. However, just before he set foot in the Great Hall, Margie was running up to him. "An urgent meeting has been requested of you, Lord Cernier." Strange. The man was more agitated than Seth had ever seen him. Granted, that only meant he was slightly tense, a single bead of sweat shining on his forehead, but it was still disconcerting. "Thank you for delivering this message, Margie. Who has requested this meeting?" Margie bowed and said, "A young Carfelian named Cullen. He referred to himself as the Stone-Gut Forager." "Understood. Well, we certainly owe him a debt, especially after the Dream Draft discovery, so I will be happy to answer him personally." As Seth arrived at the main hall and sat down, he waved at the guards to send in the forager. What could he be here for? Maybe he saw the dire lake wolf in the mountains a few days ago, and so Seth would be able to offer him immediate assuagement. Perhaps it was a request for emergency funds due to the approaching winter, in which case the bonus prepared would go a long way to assist with that as well. Regardless, Seth was sure he could help him with anything the Carfelian had come for. However, the young lord was still taken aback a bit as the fairly imposing figure strode in from the village gateway with surprising speed that the guards couldn't match. His fearsome presence was greatly increased by the nearly 6-foot-long, seemingly well-trained boar with long iron tusks trotting forward with a heavy tread next to him. The man was quite young. His bare face with sharp features, unkempt blonde hair, and barely blotched skin put him at around 20, but his frame was one Seth had only seen in a few of the smiths and farmers, and there was an intensity in his shining blue eyes that could almost rival Madame Athel's. For a moment, Seth felt as if he was in the presence of another lord, but the immediate sense faded upon a closer look. The unrefined gait and tensed form was more indicative of a wild beast than a ruler of men. The thought of the intelligent lake wolf's eyes prodded him, but he ignored it. Seth took a deep breath, then spoke in Carfelian. "Greetings, Forager Cullen. You called for me to hear an urgent occurrence." The forager looked surprised for half a moment before his demeanor shifted with practiced ease back to the grim frown, albeit with a new air of humility. He bowed. "Yes, Lord Cernier. I have come to announce the approaching doom of the Genranites."